Some secrets stay buried in the swamp, but mine need to see the light. My name is Cordelia Beauchamp, and this is my story of survival. I never thought I'd be sharing this at 83 years old. Most people see me now, a grandmother of 5, still living in my weathered cabin on the edge of the Okefenokee Swamp in southern Georgia, and they have no idea of the darkness I carried inside for decades. The peaceful marsh waters and cypress trees that surround my home now were once silent witnesses to my suffering. Before I continue with my painful story, I'd like to ask you to subscribe to this channel for more true stories of survival. It took me decades to find my voice, and I'm grateful for each person listening. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. It gives me strength knowing my words are reaching people all across the world. Now, let me tell you how my nightmare began. I was born in 1942 when this remote corner of Charlton County was even more isolated than it is today. Our family lived off the land, with my father Elijah running a small bait and tackle shop that catered to the few tourists brave enough to venture into the swamplands. The swamp provides. That's what Daddy always said before the war changed him. Those waters gave us fish, the woods gave us game, and our little garden plot gave us vegetables. We weren't rich by any means, but we had enough. Mama, Rose, made the most beautiful hand-woven baskets from sweetgrass that she'd sell at the general store in Folkestone, about 20 miles from our home. We lived simple but content lives until Daddy was drafted in 1943. When he returned in 45, something in him had darkened. The Elijah Beauchamp who came back was a shell of the man who'd left. His eyes, once bright with mischief and warmth like polished amber, had turned dull and distant, as murky as the deepest parts of the swamp. He'd brought back ghosts from the Pacific that haunted him day and night. At first, he tried to chase them away with moonshine from Old Man Jenkins, who ran a still deep in the cypress groves, where even the law wouldn't venture. The drinking started slow, just on Saturdays when the nightmares seemed worst. Then it became Fridays and Saturdays. Soon enough, that bottle became his daily companion. I still remember the smell, that sharp, acrid scent of cheap liquor that would announce his state before he even stumbled through our door. Our little cabin, built by my grandfather's hands from cypress wood, had always been my sanctuary. It sat on stilts to keep the floodwaters at bay, with a wide porch where Mama and I would shell peas and watch the herons fishing at dusk. But after Daddy returned, that same cabin became my prison. "Get yourself hidden, Cordelia," Mama would whisper when we heard his John boat approaching through the cattails and saw grass. "Go on now, baby. Make yourself small." I'd run to my hiding spot, a hollow beneath the wooden floorboards that Mama had shown me, accessible only by moving a particular loose plank under my bed. It was barely big enough for my 8-year-old body, but I'd curl up like a pill bug, hugging my knees to my chest. From that dark space, I could hear everything. The heavy thud of his boots on the porch steps, the door slamming against the wall, and then his voice, slurred and menacing. "Where's my dinner, woman? This place is a mess." No matter how spotless Mama kept our home or how perfectly timed his meal was, it was never good enough. The first time he hit her, I heard the sound before I understood what it was. A crack like a dry branch snapping, followed by Mama's muffled cry. "Please, Elijah," she'd beg. "Cordelia will hear you." But her pleas only seemed to enrage him more. "Let her hear," he'd roar. "Let the whole damn swamp hear. This is my house, and you'll both learn some respect." Some nights were worse than others. When the fish weren't biting, when a tourist complained about not seeing an alligator, when the engine on his boat sputtered, any small frustration would be amplified by the alcohol until it exploded against us. Mama took the worst of it, always positioning herself between him and my bedroom, absorbing his rage to protect me. But some nights, even her sacrifice wasn't enough. I'd hear him demanding, "Where is she? Where's that girl hiding?" The terror of those moments is something I can still feel in my bones all these decades later. The accelerated heartbeat, the shallow breathing, the desperate prayer that the floorboard above me wouldn't creak and give away my position. The neighbors were too far to hear our screams. Our nearest one, the Wilkes family, lived a good 2 miles down the water channel, and in the swamp, sound gets swallowed by the dense foliage and hanging moss. Besides, folks around here lived by an unspoken code. What happens in a man's home is his business alone. Mama started wearing long sleeves, even in the stifling Georgia summer heat. She'd smile weakly at the curious glances from Mrs. Jenkins at the general store, explaining away the bruise on her cheek as a clumsy fall off the dock or an accident while gathering firewood. I learned young to perfect the art of lying, telling my teacher that I'd gotten my split lip from running into a door. The worst night came during a thunderstorm in the summer of '52. I was 10 years old. The rain had been coming down in sheets for days, flooding parts of the swamp that never usually saw water. Daddy couldn't take his boat out, couldn't run the shop, couldn't escape our small cabin. He'd been drinking since morning, growing more agitated as the day wore on, pacing like a caged panther. When he ran out of liquor, his rage reached a breaking point. I was hiding in my usual spot when I heard Mama scream. Not her usual muffled cry, but a sound of pure terror that made my blood freeze. There was a crash, the sound of glass shattering, and then a thud so heavy it made the floorboards above me vibrate. I don't know what made me brave enough that night. Maybe it was hearing Mama's sobbing suddenly stop. Maybe it was the primal instinct that told me if I didn't act, something irreversible would happen. I pushed up on the plank and emerged from my hiding place to find Daddy standing over Mama's motionless form, a broken whiskey bottle in his hand, blood mixing with alcohol on the wooden floor. "You killed her," I whispered, my voice sounding strange and distant to my own ears. "You finally killed her." He turned to me then, his eyes focusing with difficulty, not recognizing me for a moment. When he did, something shifted in his face. Shock, perhaps, or the first flicker of remorse I'd ever seen there, but it was too late for remorse. What I didn't know then was that this night would mark the beginning of the end of our nightmare. But the path to freedom would be longer and more painful than my young mind could have imagined. Mama didn't die that night, though sometimes I wonder if part of her spirit left her body and never returned. Dr. Harrison from town came out to our cabin after I managed to paddle our spare John boat through the rain to the Wilkes place. He stitched up the gash on her head and set her broken arm, his lips pressed into a thin line of disapproval. But like everyone else in Charlton County, he asked no questions. "She fell," Daddy told him, suddenly sober enough to craft a convincing lie. "Rose has always been clumsy on these wet boards. I told her to be careful during the storm." Dr. Harrison's eyes flicked toward me, standing in the corner with my arms wrapped around myself, then back to my father. "Make sure she rests, Elijah. Head injuries can be tricky." That was all he said before packing up his black bag and leaving us alone again. The incident marked a turning point, though not the one I'd prayed for. Daddy became more careful after that, not kinder, just more calculated. He learned to leave marks where clothes would hide them. He made sure neighbors never saw the worst of it, and he discovered that threatening Mama was the surest way to control me. "One word to anyone, Cordelia," he'd hiss, gripping my thin shoulder until his fingers left bruises. "And your Mama will pay the price. You understand me, girl?" I understood all too well. By the time I turned 16 in 1958, I'd become an expert at maintaining our family's facade. At school, I was quiet but polite. I earned good grades and joined the choir at the Baptist church where we attended every Sunday, Daddy wearing his pressed shirt and Mama and I in our best dresses with high collars and long sleeves, regardless of the sweltering heat. We were the picture of a hard-working swamp family, modest means, but good Christian folk. That Beauchamp family is salt of the earth. I once overheard Mrs. Calloway tell another woman at the church potluck. Elijah fought for our country, and just look how devoted he is to Rose and their daughter. I wanted to scream the truth until my throat bled, but instead, I smiled and offered them both a slice of Mama's sweet potato pie. The 1960s brought changes to the world beyond our swamp. We'd gotten electricity in our cabin by then, and the ancient radio Daddy had salvaged and repaired became our window to the outside world. Civil rights marches, Vietnam, women burning bras, it all seemed like dispatches from another planet compared to our isolated existence. Nothing changed in our home, though. If anything, Daddy grew more resentful as the years passed. The few tourists who still came to fish were now interested in airboat tours of the swamp instead of his traditional guide services. The world was rushing forward, and he was being left behind, a feeling he drowned in even more liquor. By 1965, I was 23 years old. Most girls my age had long since married or moved away to cities like Savannah or Jacksonville in search of work. But I remained, tethered to our cabin by invisible chains, my love for Mama and the fear of what would happen to her if I left. "You should go, Cordelia," she whispered one night as we sat on the back porch, shelling peas while Daddy was passed out inside. The years had not been kind to her. At 45, her once beautiful face was lined with deep furrows, her dark hair streaked with gray, her body permanently curved like a question mark from years of cowering. "There's nothing for you here but sorrow. I won't leave you with him," I replied, the same answer I'd given hundreds of times before. She reached across and took my hand, her fingers calloused and bent. "I made my choice when I married him, but you deserve a life." What she didn't understand was that I'd long since resigned myself to having no life beyond the swamp. I'd had one suitor, Jackson Tanner, son of the man who owned the general store. He'd taken a shine to me when I'd come in for supplies, always finding reasons to carry my packages or offer me a cold soda on hot days. He was kind and gentle, everything my father wasn't. When he finally worked up the courage to ask me to the county fair in '63, I accepted in a moment of weakness, dreaming of normalcy. That single evening of laughter, of his hand tentatively holding mine on the Ferris wheel, of cotton candy melting on my tongue. It felt like stealing something precious that wasn't meant for me. Daddy was waiting on the porch when Jackson brought me home, his eyes glittering dangerously in the darkness. He thanked Jackson courteously enough, but once the boy's truck had disappeared down the dirt road, he dragged me inside by my hair. "You think you're too good for us now? Think you can parade around with shopkeepers' sons?" He punctuated each question with a blow. "Your place is here, taking care of your mother. You owe us that much." Mama tried to intervene, and he knocked her against the wall for her trouble. The next day, when Jackson came by with wildflowers, I met him at the dock and told him I couldn't see him anymore. The confusion and hurt in his eyes haunted me for years afterward. Life settled into a grim routine after that. I took over running the bait shop while Daddy drank. Sometimes he'd disappear for days, and those brief respites were like coming up for air after being held underwater. Mama and I would sit together on the porch, sometimes talking, sometimes just listening to the chorus of frogs and insects that made the swamp come alive at dusk. In the summer of 1968, something unexpected happened. The Carpenter family moved into Old Man Jenkins' place after he passed. They weren't locals. They'd come down from Maryland because Mr. Carpenter had some notion about starting an ecotourism business in the Okefenokee. They had a daughter, Sharon, about my age, who'd come with them reluctantly from what I gathered. Sharon sought me out almost immediately, starved for company her own age in this unfamiliar territory. She'd appear at our shop, full of questions about the swamp, about local customs, about my life. She was like no one I'd ever met, confident, outspoken, wearing pants instead of dresses, and speaking openly about women's liberation. "Don't you ever want more than this?" she asked me once, gesturing broadly at the surrounding wetlands. We were sitting on the dock behind our shop, feet dangling over the dark water. "This is all I know," I answered, though the words tasted bitter. "That's not what I asked," she pressed, fixing me with eyes that seemed to see right through the careful walls I'd built. Before I could formulate a response, Daddy's boat appeared around the bend. One look at his unsteady handling told me he was already deep in the bottle, though it was barely past noon. "You should go," I told Sharon quickly, rising to my feet. She frowned but gathered her things. As she was leaving, she paused. "We're having a cookout on Saturday. You and your parents should come." I nodded noncommittally, knowing we wouldn't attend. As predicted, Daddy scoffed at the invitation when I reluctantly mentioned it. "Fancy Northerners," he spat. "Think they can just move down here and change everything. They won't last one winter in the swamp." But Sharon Carpenter changed something all the same. She planted a dangerous seed in my mind, the possibility of questioning, of wanting, of perhaps finding the courage to break the cycle of silence that had defined our lives for so long. That seed took root during the worst beating Mama received since that stormy night in '52. It happened in early fall of 1969. Daddy had gone to Folkestone for supplies and returned in a rage because the truck had gotten a flat tire on the back roads. He stormed into the kitchen where Mama was preserving the last of the summer vegetables. I was in the yard, hanging laundry, when I heard the first crash. By the time I made it inside, he had her pinned against the counter, his hand around her throat. Empty mason jars shattered on the floor around them. "You worthless bitch," he was saying, his words slurring together. 25 years I've kept a roof over your head, and what have you done for me? Nothing but complain and turn my own daughter against me." The look in Mama's eyes as she struggled for air ignited something primal within me. She wasn't even fighting back anymore. Her arms hung limply at her sides, acceptance of her fate written across her features. In that moment, I knew. If something didn't change, one of us wouldn't survive much longer. And I was done being silent. I had never struck another human being in my life. Growing up watching violence unfold daily had made me abhor it. Yet there I stood in our kitchen, a cast-iron skillet clutched in my trembling hands, watching my father's grip loosen around Mama's throat as he turned to face me with disbelief clouding his bloodshot eyes. "What do you think you're doing, girl?" he growled, his attention shifting from Mama to me. She slid down the cabinet to the floor, gasping for air, her fingers gingerly touching the angry red marks blooming on her neck. The skillet felt impossibly heavy. "Let her go," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, but steadier than I expected. "Don't touch her again." He laughed then, a harsh sound devoid of humor. "Or what? You'll hit your own daddy, after everything I've done for you?" He took a step toward me, glass crunching beneath his boots. "Put that down before you hurt yourself." I didn't move. 27 years of fear had crystallized into something else, a cold, hard resolve. I thought of Sharon Carpenter's words about wanting more, about the women I'd read about in the rare magazines that made their way to our corner of the swamp, women fighting for their rights in cities far from here. If they could march in the streets, surely I could stand my ground in my own kitchen. "I mean it," I said, louder this time. "This ends tonight." His face darkened, that familiar storm gathering. "You ungrateful little—" He lunged forward, but years of drinking had slowed his reflexes. I sidestepped, keeping the heavy pan between us. "Cordelia, don't!" Mama pleaded from the floor, her voice raspy. "He'll kill you." Perhaps she was right. Perhaps challenging him would be the death of me. But in that moment, I realized I'd been dying slowly for years anyway, pieces of my soul chipping away with each blow he landed, each scream that echoed through our cabin. Each morning, we pretended everything was fine. "Go ahead," I taunted him, surprising myself with my boldness. "Show me what a big man you are, beating women who can't fight back. What would your war buddies think of you now, Elijah Beauchamp? Using his full name was a deliberate provocation, one he couldn't ignore. He charged at me with a roar, and this time, instinct took over. I swung the skillet with all my might, connecting with the side of his head with a sickening thud. He staggered, confusion replacing rage as his knees buckled. He collapsed onto the kitchen floor among the shattered mason jars, blood seeping from a gash on his temple. The silence that followed was deafening. The cast iron slipped from my fingers, clattering to the floor. I stood frozen, staring at my father's prone form, certain I'd killed him. The soft rise and fall of his chest told me otherwise, but the knowledge brought little relief. "Mama," I whispered, dropping to my knees beside her. "Are you all right? Can you stand?" She nodded weakly, her eyes never leaving Daddy's unconscious form. "What have you done, Cordelia? When he wakes up, he's not going to hurt us anymore," I told her, helping her to her feet. "We're leaving." Her eyes widened in panic. "Leaving? Where would we go? This is our home." "This is our prison," I corrected her gently. "And I should have broken us out years ago." Moving quickly, I guided her to her bedroom and instructed her to pack only what she absolutely needed. I did the same, stuffing a small bag with a change of clothes, the little money I'd managed to secretly save over the years, a mere $43, and the faded photograph of my grandparents that was my only connection to family beyond my parents. Mama moved mechanically, decades of obedience making it impossible for her to refuse a direct instruction, even from me. But her hands shook violently as she folded a nightgown into her bag. "He'll find us," she whispered, glancing fearfully toward the kitchen. "He always says nobody leaves him." "We'll go somewhere he won't think to look," I assured her, though I had no concrete plan. My mind raced through possibilities. We had few relatives. Mama's people were from South Alabama, but she hadn't seen them since before I was born. My father had effectively isolated us from anyone who might have offered help. "Except the Carpenters," I said suddenly. "Sharon said they came down from Maryland. Her father has that new touring business. They have a truck. Maybe they could help us get to the bus station in Waycross." Mama looked uncertain, but her objections died on her lips as a groan emanated from the kitchen. Daddy was starting to stir. "Now, Mama," I urged, grabbing both our bags and her hand. "We have to go now." We slipped out the back door and into the sweltering September night. The full moon illuminated the boardwalk that led from our cabin to the water's edge, where our boats were tied. The smaller John boat would be quieter, less likely to alert Daddy if he regained consciousness. I helped Mama in, untied the mooring rope, and pushed us away from the dock with the pole, navigating us into the dark channel that would take us toward the Carpenter's place. The swamp at night was a different world, mysterious and alive, with sounds that would terrify most outsiders. But to me, the chorus of bullfrogs, the occasional splash of a fish or alligator, and the whisper of wind through the cypress trees were the familiar soundtrack of home. The Spanish moss hanging from the branches looked silvery in the moonlight, creating ghostly archways as we glided through the waterways. Mama sat silently in the bow, her face a pale oval in the darkness. I couldn't tell if she was crying. She had learned to weep soundlessly years ago. The realization sent a fresh wave of anger through me, fueling my determination. It took nearly an hour to reach the Carpenter's dock. Their cabin was larger than ours, recently renovated with a screened porch and solar panels on the roof, modern touches that had been the subject of gossip among the few families scattered throughout the swamp. A light was still on inside, and as I secured our boat, the screen door creaked open. "Hello?" Sharon's voice called out cautiously. "Who's there?" "It's Cordelia Beauchamp," I answered, helping Mama onto the dock. "And my mother. We need help." Sharon appeared at the edge of the dock, a flashlight in hand. Its beam illuminated first my face, then traveled to my mother, lingering on the bruises around her throat. Sharon's expression shifted from wariness to concern in an instant. "Come inside," she said simply, turning to lead the way. What followed was a flurry of activity I could scarcely process in my adrenaline-fueled state. Mr. Carpenter, a tall man with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, made calls on their telephone, while Mrs. Carpenter tended to Mama's injuries with a gentleness that brought tears to my eyes. Sharon sat beside me at their kitchen table, pressing a mug of hot tea into my hands that I couldn't bring myself to drink. "You did the right thing," she kept saying. "You're safe now." But I knew better. As long as we remained in Charlton County, as long as Daddy was alive and knew where to find us, we would never be truly safe. Mr. Carpenter confirmed my fears when he returned to the kitchen, his expression grave. "I spoke with Sheriff Daniels. He says without witnesses, it's your father's word against yours, and Elijah Beauchamp has friends in the department. He tried to kill my mother," I said, my voice rising. "The evidence is right there on her neck." "Accidents happen, Mr. Ho," Carpenter replied gently, repeating what would undoubtedly be my father's defense. "Especially in homes where alcohol is present. I'm sorry, Miss Beauchamp, but the sheriff made it clear he's not inclined to pursue charges." The injustice of it burned like acid in my throat. This was 1969. The world was changing, or so I'd heard. Men had walked on the moon that July. Women were demanding equality. And yet here, in this forgotten corner of Georgia, time stood still. A man could still terrorize his family with impunity. "Then we need to leave," I said firmly. "Tonight, as far away as possible." Mrs. Carpenter exchanged a look with her husband. "Where will you go?" I hesitated, realizing I had no answer. Mama and I had never been farther than Jacksonville. We had no skills that would translate to city living, no education beyond high school, no connections outside the swamp. "I have a sister in Baltimore," Sharon said suddenly. "She works at a women's shelter. She could help you get on your feet, find jobs." "Baltimore?" Mama whispered, the words sounding as foreign as Paris or Rome might have. "That's so far." "That's the point," I told her, squeezing her hand. "He won't follow us there." Mr. Carpenter cleared his throat. "I'm driving to Savannah tomorrow to pick up some equipment. I could take you to the bus station there. You'd have more options than from Waycross." Hope, that dangerous and unfamiliar emotion, fluttered in my chest. "We don't have much money," I admitted. "We'll help with the tickets," Mrs. Carpenter said firmly. "It's the Christian thing to do." Sharon disappeared briefly, returning with a small wooden box. "My tip money from working at my aunt's diner last summer," she explained, pressing several bills into my hand. "Take it. You'll need it more than I do." I wanted to refuse, but knew I couldn't afford pride. Instead, I whispered a thank you that felt woefully inadequate for the lifeline they were offering. The Carpenters insisted we stay the night, Mrs. Carpenter making up the sofa bed while Sharon shared her room with me. I barely slept, listening for the sound of Daddy's boat engine, imagining him storming through the door to drag us back home. Each creak of the cabin settling, each call of a night bird sent my heart racing. Dawn broke with a symphony of bird song and insect calls, the swamp awakening around us as if nothing had changed, though everything had. Mr. Carpenter loaded our meager bags into his truck while Mrs. Carpenter pressed a paper bag of sandwiches into my hands. "For the journey," she explained with a gentle smile. Sharon hugged me fiercely before we climbed into the truck. "Write to me," she urged, slipping a piece of paper with her address into my pocket. "Let me know you're safe." Mama was silent as we drove away, her gaze fixed on the swampland passing by the window. I wondered if she was saying goodbye to the only home she'd known for nearly 3 decades, or if she was scanning the water for signs of Daddy's pursuit. "Are we doing the right thing?" she asked finally, her voice barely audible over the truck's engine. I took her hand, noting how small and fragile it felt in mine. For so long, she had been my protector, placing herself between me and Daddy's rage. Now our roles had reversed. "Yes, Mama," I said, with a conviction I didn't entirely feel. We're finally doing the right thing. The drive to Savannah took nearly 3 hours, through small towns and stretches of pine forests that gradually gave way to the coastal plain. Mama dozed fitfully beside me, exhaustion finally overtaking her anxiety. Mr. Carpenter kept the radio on low. News about Vietnam, debates about the Apollo program, music unlike anything we heard on our old radio at home. The bus station in Savannah was bustling with activity. Soldiers in uniform, families with children, businessmen with briefcases. Mr. Carpenter helped us purchase tickets for the northbound bus, leaving at noon. Baltimore was nearly 15 hours away, with transfers in Charleston and Richmond. "You ladies sure you'll be all right?" he asked as departure time approached. "We'll manage," I assured him, though the prospect of navigating this journey terrified me almost as much as facing Daddy had. "Thank you for everything." He nodded, pressing an extra $20 into my hand before leaving us to board. Mama clung to my arm as we found our seats near the middle of the bus, her eyes wide as she took in our fellow travelers. "I've never been this far from home," she whispered. "Me neither," I admitted. "But we're together." As the bus pulled away from the station, I caught a glimpse of our reflection in the window. 2 women with identical hollow-eyed expressions and tense shoulders, bracing for a blow that wasn't coming. Not anymore. It would take time, I knew, for us to unlearn the habits of fear, to stop flinching at sudden movements, to believe in the possibility of safety. The highway stretched before us, leading away from the swamp, away from Daddy, away from the only life we'd known. I had no illusions that the road ahead would be easy. We were 2 uneducated swamp women with nothing but a few dollars and the clothes on our backs. But for the first time in 27 years, we were free. And that made all the difference in the world. Baltimore in 1969 might as well have been another planet compared to the Okefenokee swamp. The noise, the crowds, the endless concrete and brick buildings towering above us. It overwhelmed Mama so severely that she wouldn't leave our room at the women's shelter for the first 3 days. Sharon's sister, Judith, had met us at the bus station as promised, bringing us to the converted brownstone in a neighborhood she called transitional. "It's not much," she'd apologized, showing us to a small room with twin beds and a shared bathroom down the hall. "But it's safe. No men allowed past the front desk." Those words, "it's safe," echoed in my mind during those initial bewildering weeks. Safety had been such a foreign concept for so long that I kept waiting for it to be snatched away, for Daddy to somehow track us down and drag us back to Georgia. Every time the shelter's front door opened, I'd freeze, my heart pounding wildly until I confirmed it wasn't him. Mama fared worse. Decades of abuse had left deeper scars on her than the physical ones that marked her body. She jumped at loud noises, kept her eyes downcast when speaking to anyone, and slept fitfully, often waking with muffled screams. The simplest decisions paralyzed her. What to eat, what to wear, whether to step outside for fresh air. Without Daddy dictating her every move, she seemed lost, adrift in a freedom she'd never been prepared to navigate. "Some women have been so controlled for so long that independence feels like drowning," explained Dorothy, the shelter's resident counselor, a stern-faced woman with kind eyes who held group sessions 3 times a week. "Your mother's identity was stripped away years ago. She needs to rediscover who she is without your father's shadow looming over her." I attended those sessions religiously, sitting in a circle with women whose stories mirrored our own in horrifying ways. There was Marlene, whose husband had disciplined her with his belt when dinner wasn't to his liking. Yvonne, whose boyfriend had broken her arm when she spoke to a male neighbor. Teresa, who'd fled her home with 3 small children after her husband threatened them with his service revolver. Different circumstances, different backgrounds, but the same haunted expressions, the same habitual flinching, the same nightmares that disturbed their sleep. For the first time, I understood that what had happened in our cabin wasn't unique to us. It was a terrible pattern repeating itself in homes across America, hidden behind closed doors and maintained by silence. Initially, I couldn't bring myself to speak during these sessions. The swamp had taught me to keep secrets, to bury pain deep where no one could see it. But gradually, listening to these women's courage in sharing their stories loosened something within me. On a rainy Tuesday in November, I finally spoke. I thought it was normal, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. Until I was about 8, I thought all fathers beat their wives and children. I thought all mothers hid bruises under their clothing. I thought all families lived with that kind of fear. The tears came then, years of suppressed grief flooding out in great, heaving sobs that seemed to come from the very core of my being. The women gathered around me, hands on my shoulders, my back, my arms. Gentle touches meant to comfort, so different from the blows I'd grown accustomed to flinching away from. That breakthrough marked the beginning of my healing, though the path forward remained difficult. Judith had helped both Mama and me find jobs. Mama cleaning rooms at a downtown hotel and me waiting tables at a diner near the harbor. The work was exhausting, the pay meager, but it allowed us to move into a tiny one-bedroom apartment by Christmas of 1969. Our little apartment became Mama's sanctuary. She transformed it with the same homemaking skills she'd once used to try to placate Daddy, creating curtains from discount fabric, scrubbing the worn linoleum until it shone, arranging wildflowers in jelly jars on our second-hand table. For the first time, she could make a space truly hers, without fear of his criticism or rage. I, meanwhile, found myself drawn to the world outside. Baltimore in the early 1970s was alive with change. Women's liberation meetings in church basements, civil rights discussions in coffee shops, anti-war protests in the streets. I devoured newspapers, listened to radical radio programs, and slowly began to understand the larger forces that had shaped our isolation in the swamp. Your father didn't just happen to be a violent man, Dorothy explained during one of our private counseling sessions. He was shaped by a society that taught men they owned their wives and children, that masculinity meant dominance, that problems should be solved with fists rather than words. Understanding that doesn't excuse what he did, but it helps explain it. This perspective was revolutionary to me. I'd spent my life viewing Daddy as a monster, unique in his cruelty. Recognizing that his behavior was part of a broader pattern of patriarchal control helped me place our suffering in context. It wasn't our fault. It had never been our fault. In the spring of 1971, I enrolled in night classes at the community college, studying while Mama slept and on my breaks at the diner. The shelter had a small scholarship fund for survivors continuing their education, and Judith helped me apply. My high school education from rural Georgia had left significant gaps, but I attacked my studies with a determination born of knowing this was my one chance at a different life. Mama watched my educational journey with a mixture of pride and bewilderment. I never even thought about college, she confessed one evening as I studied at our kitchen table. In my day, girls just got married. That was the only future we were told to want. Times are changing, Mama, I told her, reaching for her hand. Women can want more now. She smiled sadly. I'm glad you can. I think I'm too old to change that much. But she was changing, in her own quiet way. She joined a church near our apartment, finding community among the congregation's older women. She took up knitting, creating scarves and blankets that she donated to the shelter that had first taken us in. Small steps toward a self that existed independent of my father's control. The road wasn't always smooth. There were setbacks. Nights when the nightmares returned with such ferocity that neither of us could sleep. Days when a man's raised voice in public would send Mama into a state of panic. Moments when I caught myself falling into the defensive habits of our previous life. Healing wasn't linear. It spiraled back on itself sometimes, revisiting old wounds before moving forward again. In the summer of 1972, we received a letter forwarded through the shelter's address. My hands trembled as I recognized Sharon Carpenter's handwriting. Inside was news that stopped my heart momentarily. Daddy had died that spring. His boat had been found drifting empty in the swamp. The authorities assumed he'd fallen overboard, perhaps drunk and drowned. His body was recovered 3 days later. I read the letter to Mama, watching her face for a reaction. She crossed herself slowly, whispered a prayer, and then went to make a pot of tea as if it were any ordinary day. Later that night, I found her on our small balcony, gazing at the sliver of moon visible between the city buildings. I thought I'd feel something more, she confessed. Relief, maybe, or even grief, but I just feel nothing. That's okay, Mama, I assured her, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. You don't owe him any particular feeling. She nodded, leaning against me. We're truly free now, aren't we? We were. The constant fear that he might somehow find us, that we might encounter him on a street corner or see his face in a crowd, evaporated. Another weight lifted from our shoulders. 2 months after receiving that news, I met Daniel at the library, where I'd taken to studying between classes and shifts at the diner. He was a graduate student researching wetland ecosystems, of all things. When I mentioned I'd grown up in the Okefenokee, his face lit up with genuine interest. That's incredible. I've only read about it in journals. What was it like living there? For the first time, I found myself able to separate the natural beauty of my homeland from the trauma that had occurred within it. I told him about alligators sunning themselves on logs, about the symphony of frogs at dusk, about the way cypress knees poked through the dark water like the fingers of giants. I described the wildflowers that carpeted the hammocks in spring, the taste of freshly caught catfish, the mesmerizing dance of fireflies on summer evenings. You speak about it like a poet, he said, his eyes warm with admiration rather than the pity I'd grown accustomed to seeing when people learned fragments of my past. Our courtship progressed slowly, deliberately. I was cautious by nature now, watchful for red flags, for any sign that the gentle man who brought me wildflowers and listened intently to my opinions might harbor darker tendencies. Daniel seemed to intuitively understand my wariness, never pushing for more than I was ready to give, always asking before reaching for my hand or putting an arm around my shoulders. I introduced him to Mama nearly 6 months after we began dating. She was polite but reserved, studying him with the careful assessment of a woman who had learned the hard way that men could wear charming masks. It took almost a year before she truly warmed to him, before she stopped tensing when he entered a room. On a clear October day in 1974, Daniel and I were married in a small ceremony at Mama's church. As I stood before the altar, in a simple white dress, I caught sight of Mama in the front pew, tears streaming down her face, not tears of fear or pain, but of joy. Beside her sat Dorothy from the shelter, Judith and Sharon, and several women from our support group who had become dear friends. Family we had chosen, bound by shared understanding rather than blood. Our wedding night was spent in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia, in a cabin that bore no resemblance to the one I'd grown up in. Daniel understood my anxiety about isolated settings, ensuring we stayed somewhere with nearby neighbors and a telephone. His patience as we navigated the physical aspects of our relationship, my instinctive flinching at sudden movements, my occasional panic when feeling restrained, demonstrated a depth of compassion I once wouldn't have believed possible in a man. Love isn't supposed to hurt, he told me one night as we lay together, his fingers gently tracing the faded scar on my shoulder, a souvenir from one of Daddy's belt buckles. You deserve gentleness, Cordelia. We all do. In 1976, our daughter Rose was born, named for my mother, who held her granddaughter with trembling hands and a face transformed by wonder. Watching Mama with Rose, I caught glimpses of who she might have been without decades of abuse. Playful, tender, her laughter coming more freely than I could ever remember. Motherhood brought its own challenges, triggering fears I thought I'd conquered. What if I carried violence in my blood? What if I couldn't break the cycle? The first time Rose had a tantrum, screaming inconsolably while I tried everything to soothe her, I found myself stepping away, hands shaking, terrified by the flash of frustration I'd felt. Daniel found me sitting on our back steps, breathing deeply to calm myself. Without judgment, he took my hand. "You're not him, Cordelia. You never will be. You walked away, remember? You chose a different path." Those words became my mantra as we raised our children, Rose and later Thomas, born in 1979. I made deliberate choices every day to parent with patience and tenderness, to apologize when I made mistakes, to show them that love could be steadfast and unconditional. We talked openly about feelings in our household, encouraged questions, and never ever raised a hand in anger. When Rose was 7, she asked about the photograph of Mama and me that sat on our mantel, a picture taken shortly after we arrived in Baltimore, our faces thin and eyes wary. "Why do you and Grandma look so sad there?" she asked innocently. Daniel and I had discussed how we would eventually explain my past to our children. Not the graphic details, but enough truth that they would understand the importance of respect and gentleness. "Grandma and I had to leave our old home because it wasn't safe," I explained, pulling her onto my lap. "Sometimes people who should love each other don't know how to do it properly. They hurt each other instead." Her small face scrunched in confusion. "Like hitting?" "Yes, like that," I acknowledged. "But we came to Baltimore to start over, to find people who knew how to love kindly. Like your daddy and like you." She considered this seriously before declaring, "I'm glad you're safe now." Those simple words, echoing what Judith had told us on our first night at the shelter, brought tears to my eyes. "Me too, sweetheart. Me too." Mama lived with us until her peaceful passing in 1992, having watched her grandchildren grow into teenagers who knew her only as the gentle woman who taught them to bake biscuits and identify bird calls, who told them stories about growing up in the swamp, but never about the darker chapters of her life there. At her funeral, I spoke about her resilience, her capacity for joy, despite everything that had tried to crush it out of her. "My mother was stronger than anyone knew," I told the gathered mourners, including herself. Now, as I rock on my porch in my own older years, watching my grandchildren play in the yard of the home Daniel and I have shared for over 4 decades, I marvel at how far I've come from that terrified young woman who fled the swamp with nothing but a small bag and a desperate hope for something better. The journey hasn't always been easy. There are still nights when the nightmares return, days when a certain smell or sound catapults me back to that kitchen in Georgia. Trauma leaves echoes that never completely fade, but they've grown fainter with time, with love, with the deliberate work of healing. I've learned that breaking the cycle isn't a single act of courage, but thousands of small choices made day after day. Choosing vulnerability when fear suggests walls, choosing trust when experience counsels suspicion, choosing gentleness when anger rises. It's rejecting the notion that suffering is inevitable or deserved. It's believing that you are worthy of peace, of joy, of tender touches that never turn to blows. If my story teaches anything, let it be this: it's never too late to begin again. No matter how deeply you've been wounded, how thoroughly you've been silenced, how completely you've been isolated, there is a path forward. There are hands reaching out to help you take those first terrifying steps toward freedom. You are not defined by what was done to you. You are defined by your courage, your resilience, your capacity to heal and to love. That is the truth I wish someone had told the frightened girl hiding beneath floorboards all those years ago. That is the truth I've spent a lifetime proving to myself. And now, at 83, watching the sun set over a life rebuilt from ashes, I can finally say with certainty, the journey was worth every difficult step. Thank you for listening to my story. If my journey of survival touched your heart, please subscribe to the channel right now and give this video a thumbs up. Your support means everything to those of us brave enough to share our darkest memories. Don't forget to hit that notification bell so you never miss another true story of courage and resilience. And please, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I read every single one. Until next time, this is Cordelia Beauchamp, reminding you that healing is always possible.